Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Excellent. Wonderful to see so many people here. I see many of you are getting your audio connected. We'll just give a few moments for you to join us. Wonderful. Good. All right, everyone. Welcome to today's workshop on practicing anti-racism in intentional communities. My name is Cynthia. I'm going to be the host for today's session, representing the Foundation for Intentional Community. I am one of 4 co-directors with the Foundation, and I focus on events and communications. So I have a very brief introductory presentation, and then I'm going to hand it over to Avi and Sky for the rest of the session, and they'll be introducing themselves together later on. So I'm going to jump into it and share my screen. That's not what I want. There we go. All right. So I hope you have found yourself in the right place for this session on practicing anti-racism in intentional communities. This is the 4th workshop in a series we've been giving on creating more diversity in community, addressing white supremacism, all of these topics that are really timely right now and you all have been asking us to address. So we've been bringing forward this workshop series, and some of you may have been here for a session Sky gave a few weeks ago on white supremacy in intentional communities. So this is a follow-up and deepening of that session, and now he is joined also by Avi. So really excited to have both of them presenting today. And quickly, I'm going to go over a few Zoom basics if you're new to using Zoom. The first is just to remember to stay muted unless you are speaking. So you want to make sure you have that button on mute. And when you're ready to speak, you can go ahead and unmute and start your video so we can see you. And you also want to click on the participants button and the chat button so you can see who's in the room and communicate with each other. The chat function is great because you can send a message to everyone, or you can send a private message just to one person. So if you are having any technical difficulties during the session, you can send a private message to me. And really encourage you to use the chat to say hello to everyone, introduce yourself, say where you're chiming in from. And the other tool to keep in mind is the raise your hand button. We're going to have a lot of people in today's session, and so when there's an opportunity to speak in the whole group, we may not be able to easily see you if you just raise your hand on your screen. So you want to go to the participants button and then click the raise your hand button so we can see you and call on you. All right. Now I want to share about some upcoming events we have with FIC because we're filling up the calendar for August. It's really exciting. So coming up later this week on Thursday, we're going to have a talk with Jono Bacon on how to build community in the digital age. That's going to be a live talk with Q&A starting at 5 p.m. Eastern. And Jono is an incredible author who focuses on collaboration methodologies for building teams and groups specifically using online tools. So also a very relevant topic for right now when a lot of us are forced to connect online. So I hope you'll join me for that. We also have a session on legal basics for intentional communities. So knowing the basics about how to get your new community up and running or make sure that your established community is on good legal footing. That's going to be on August 18th. It's another 2-hour workshop on that topic with Clifford Paulin, who is a legal consultant. And we have with Cassandra Ferreira and Starhawk, a session on building community in the Great Uprising. Starhawk is actually the recipient of the 2021 Cosney Communitarian Award, which honors and awards a person who's really demonstrated and dedicated their life's work to building more community. And we want to honor Starhawk with that award, and Cassandra will be interviewing Starhawk, so they'll have a conversation on this topic and also virtually delivering the award. So please join us for that on August 20th. And then we have a workshop on sociocracy. A lot of you may have participated in our workshop we did on consensus decision making, and you were like, oh, okay, this is great, where's the sociocracy? So now we're offering also training on sociocracy, and that's going to be with Ted Rue, who is a trainer at Sociocracy for All, on August 25th. Okay, and if you've missed a workshop that we've done in the past, because at this point I think we've done like more than 20 workshops and online events, we've uploaded a lot of the best ones to our Vimeo page. And it's just at this link, ic.org/recordings. And you can rent or purchase and download any of the recordings that you may have missed and you want to watch. So I encourage you to check that out. And we have a very big announcement that we just shared this morning publicly, and now want to share with all of you because it's related to the topic of today's session and is a big deal for FIC. So the announcement is that starting now, FIC is giving 10% of all incoming unrestricted donations to support BIPOC in joining, forming, and developing intentional communities. So Black, Indigenous, and people of color who want to join, form, or develop their intentional community, FIC is working on putting together a council that will be a BIPOC council to help determine how those monies will be spent and distributed. So it's an exciting initiative, and we encourage you all to consider making a donation, because from this point forward, 10% of any donation that you make to FIC will go to support this new initiative. So it's the BIPOC Intentional Communities Fund. And Sky had a hand in shaping this, as well as many other groups. This kind of conversation was bumbling up about, we want to do more to support these groups. Now's the time. So we said, okay, we're going to give 10% of our incoming donations to this initiative. And it's still evolving, so encourage you to reach out if you have questions, or if you're interested in maybe joining the council or know someone who might be a good fit for that. Sky or Avi, do you want to add anything about the fund?
I'll just say that I've been working most recently with Kaisan Tanabe and Crystal Farmer, who are both on the FIC board and both people of color on the FIC board, around forming this council. And the FIC felt like it was a good idea to just go ahead and make this public commitment to start putting aside these monies. And we kind of see the next big step as getting this all Black, Indigenous, people of color council together to really make the decisions and sort of guide the formation of this whole thing going forward. So that's kind of the next big step. And then from there, there's going to be a whole lot more coming in terms of how exactly it will be used, fundraising for it. So definitely stay tuned. It's definitely a work in progress. But I'm really excited that the FIC has gone ahead and made this commitment to just kind of get the ball rolling with it.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited too. And more to come. More information coming. All right. So that's about everything I have. So just a moment here before we get started to remove any distractions. Have something to drink nearby, maybe note-taking material, and just to sort of center yourself and arrive for today's session, letting go of whatever else may have happened earlier in your day and getting ready to be together for the next 2 hours. And I have a quick group poll for you that Avi and Sky put together. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and launch the poll. And let's get that started. You can see there's 5 questions in this poll. So I'm going to launch the poll and then hand it over to Sky and Avi to introduce themselves, and you can fill out the poll while they're also introducing themselves. So without further ado, take it away, Sky and Avi.
Thanks, Cynthia. So yeah, we wanted to get a good sense of who's in the room. So that's kind of where the poll comes in handy. So take your time on that for this section. But just so you know, I'm Avi. I'm the co-director of Community Wellbeing at Mount Madonna Center, which is an intentional community and retreat center for yoga. I first came to the community in 2011 and have either lived here or been involved ever since. I also grew up in a very loving home where differences were the norm. My mom's Black, my dad is white, my mom's a practicing Christian, my dad's a practicing Jew. My mom is loud and outgoing, my dad's pretty quiet and soft-spoken. So these differences, this way of growing up really gave me a deep appreciation for living in and with diversity in various forms, which I carry forward to every community that I'm a part of. That's me.
And my name is Sky Blue, and yes, that is my real name, and yes, my parents were hippies. I've been involved with intentional communities and cooperative groups for more than 20 years at this point, both living and working in them, as well as doing networking and movement building, including 4 years as executive director of the FIC. And for me, intentional communities are responses to the problems of the world and are uniquely positioned to experiment with solutions to systemic problems like racism. I was raised poor white hippie. My parents, as mentioned, are hippies and met at Twin Oaks community in the late 70s. I wasn't born or raised there. But I very much feel like the intentional communities movement is where I am from. And I also just want to say I'm excited to be able to come back after the workshop I led a few weeks ago on examining white supremacy culture. And as Cynthia mentioned, this is also following up a lot from a couple weeks ago. Crystal Farmer did a workshop on practicing anti-racism, and Avi and I are happy to be given the opportunity to sort of take the work that she did and then sort of try and drill down a little bit more into detail about how does this apply to intentional communities in particular. So thanks all for joining us in this.
Yeah, so a little bit about Sky and we met at the West Coast Communities Conference a few years ago, and our working relationship began around a mutual interest in cultivating more inclusion and access in intentional communities. So we've been exploring the topic ever since, including identifying barriers and unearthing possibilities for moving forward. But all of that to say that we are definitely not experts here to teach you how to practice. We just want to make that clear as an expectation. We see ourselves as colleagues with a passion to create change, much like you, and we're here to highlight some practices and guiding principles that communities are trying or considering in this work. So like Sky said, we're building off of this workshop series that's been going on. So we'll include some introductory information so that we're all on the same page. And we also encourage you to check out those videos if you get the chance to deeper dive in. So we got about 84% of the people. Feels like a good spot. So Cynthia, if you wouldn't. Sorry?
Oh, I just said that's pretty good. Thanks everyone.
I know, right? I was like, well done, guys. Get that poll going. But let's close it up. Yeah, and let's see who's in the room. So it seems that most of us have been at this for a while. it's good to know, but generally speaking, it's kind of even from those just starting out to those that have been going at it forever. The confidence level is mixed, which is to be expected.
Understandable, yeah.
Yeah. How racially diverse is your community? Mostly homogenous. Also what we anticipated. None are very diverse, good to note. How is racial justice work in your community going? Most are just getting started or having trouble getting started. And then also it's challenging, but we're doing some good work is the second up. So it's cool to know. See, Sky, we were like, should we put the great, we're excited to share in there? But we have a couple, so that's good to know. Definitely want to hear from you and what's working for you. And then finally, this ideally and practically what you'd most like to see in your community. Yeah, we just kind of wanted to see like what's a goal, because there's so much that you can do in this work and it is helpful to have some focus. So it seems like most are hoping to reduce barriers to inclusion and access, followed by some are hoping to participate in or support anti-racism work beyond your community. Good to know. Cool. So again, we're going to be asking for examples later on. If you want, you can stop sharing. Thanks, Cynthia. So we are interested to hear not just what's working well, which is great, and also what isn't working, and where have you found some conflict and tension? Because we find that within those mistakes and those kind of messy areas, we can learn the most. So feel free to speak up whatever your experience might be.
And one other thing that with the there was sort of an assumption in the poll, particularly around how homogenous, that I wanted to highlight, which is that we are assuming that most, if not everyone on this call, are coming from predominantly or all white intentional communities, not because we're trying to exclude POC intentional communities, which do exist out there, ones that are all or majority people of color, but that's not who has been predominantly central in the network, which is definitely something that also needs to shift. But also because this work of how do we be anti-racist is obviously something more that predominantly or all white intentional communities need to be doing. So that, just to make clear, and that's kind of who we're speaking to, not because it's out of exclusion, but just because that's where we think the work needs to happen.
All right, so Sky, you want to share that screen? We'll get started.
Sure.
And yeah, I noticed that some people are putting their location in the chat, so feel free to keep that going to know also who's in the room. So before we get into the meat of the work, we just kind of want to say a little bit about what kind of a space that we're hoping that this workshop will be and how we approach this work. And this is a bit of a review for those who are at Sky's last workshop, just so you know. But this work, it can be hard, scary, and painful, and it can bring up a lot of conflict. So it's important to remember that even when that happens, and perhaps especially when that happens, that we're still trying to build relationships and build community. We're all trying to learn and grow and do better, and we're doing it because we care. So how can we be compassionate and vulnerable and curious with each other while recognizing that we all have baggage and we all mess up at times? So let's remember that our practice is to acknowledge when harm has been done, to recognize the impacts, and to get the support we need to learn, heal, and reconcile. We're in process of developing our ability to hold and support this work, both as individuals and as communities. So that said, in this workshop, we're asking everyone to model safer space. And this idea comes from a group called Dismantling Racism Works. A safer space is a place where people can come as they are to discover, assert, and empower their voices, and to encounter and listen deeply to the voices of others. Safer space is grounded in respect. It is a place where we assume positive intent. People within safer spaces are working toward developing trust over time and are seeking to understand first. Safer space require continual work and mindfulness. A seemingly safe space can turn unsafe within moments. And how we handle these moments is what really determines the safety of the space. Spaces are safer when we take responsibility for what we say, feel, and think to the extent that we can, and admit when we cannot. So the reason for all of this is to help keep the focus on doing the work that needs to be done internally, in our communities, and in society at large. So if we're shutting down, if we're lashing out, if we're avoiding, these things don't allow for the kinds of conversations that we need for personal development or for figuring out what needs to change in our communities. So again, the point is not to be right. It's to make real change that will make things better for hopefully everyone.
So from there, we wanted to just kind of lay down a little bit of some ideas about what does it mean to be an anti-racist. And again, in the last workshop that Crystal Farmer gave here through FIC, she talked about this a lot. And also there's a good reference point is the work by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist and has given various talks on that. And Crystal also shared this this chart that I thought it was worth looking at again. So it kind of lays out, sort of start in the fear zone. I deny racism a problem. I avoid hard questions. I strive to be comfortable. I talk to others who look and think like me. Moving to the learning zone, I recognize racism as a problem. I understand my own privilege. I am vulnerable about my own biases. Whoops. I listen to others who think and look differently than me. And then moving to the growth zone, I identify how I may unknowingly benefit from racism. I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. I sit with my discomfort. I speak out. I educate my peers. I don't let mistakes deter me from being better. I yield positions of power. So I think this is sort of a useful just framework, and I think part of what we need to remember is that it's not going to be it's not always a linear process. We're going to bounce back and forth between these different stages, probably for our whole lives, but that we're kind of moving more and more towards the growth stage, and that we're assuming in this workshop that you've already done some work in the learning phase, and that we're here to try and move more and more into that growth phase. The reason we're doing this work. Let me go ahead and stop sharing. The reason we're doing this work is because there's harm being done. So using cancer as a metaphor, with which Dr. Kendi did because he had cancer when he wrote that book. You might have cancer and not know it, but it's still doing harm, and you can't treat it until you know it's there, which might not be obvious until it's too late. So as white people practicing anti-racism, one thing to keep in mind is the emotional labor that people of color have to do that white people don't, to simply exist in a world where there is systemic racism. Partly this is because of things like microaggressions or othering and marginalizing that happen in daily interactions that white people don't realize are happening because it's not necessarily intentional, and usually people of color don't say anything about it. Though that is starting to shift, obviously. Another part is the social, economic, and political systems that disproportionately harm people of color, which again, white people are less likely to be aware of. But the harm is still happening. There are racial disparities across wealth, education, internet access, political power, healthcare, criminal justice, environmental quality, and there are systems and policies that are keeping those disparities in place. And that's racism. Dr. Kendi says that either you're a racist or an anti-racist, and that there really isn't such a thing as being not racist. You're either using whatever power you have to help dismantle or change those systems or address those disparities, or you're not. Working to make change is what makes you an anti-racist. I also think it's good to be clear about why we think diversity is a good thing. It's been for a very long time, it's very easy for communities and people to say we value diversity. without necessarily really thinking about what that means or why we believe that's a good thing. For one, obviously, there's just a richness of experience and perspective that diversity provides. But also, as we try to address the problems of the world, which I think intentional communities are inherently trying to do, we need to center the voices and experiences of people most affected by those problems. Also, the reason we don't have more diversity is because of the harm that's being done to people, disproportionately people of color, but not exclusively. And trying to end that harm is just the right thing to do. Diversity is also important, particularly for intentional communities, because it's about who has the privilege to access resources, to have community and the benefits of community, and then using that privilege to extend that access to others who don't have it or don't have it as readily. Another thing that I wanted to address was what a common thing I've been hearing from people over the last number of weeks as more and more groups have been starting to do this work is that it's hard to keep the momentum going. And it's maybe hard for them personally, or they see their communities sort of getting into it and then sort of the interest or enthusiasm for it waning. And why is that? And kind of really heard Crystal in her workshop, her last workshop, talk about this and say, recognize that people of color have conversations about race, or where race is infused in the conversation all the time because it's in their face and it's part of how they have to navigate the world. People of color are also more likely to already be working on racist issues like voter registration or suppression, gentrification, policing, poverty, food deserts, because they or people they know are more likely to be affected by those things. So it's easy to not think about it if you're not seeing it and living it every day, and you have to make a choice to keep working on it. One of the things Dr. Kendi said in a talk is about being an advocate as distinct from being an ally, which was the first time I'd heard that idea being brought forward. And I really liked it. And I thought, I can be an ally to people of color in their fight against anti-racism. And I, as a white person, can also be an advocate to other white people and to the systems that are in place for changing systems and culture that are racist. I'm also reminded of what a friend of mine who is Black said in a talk a while back about needing to move beyond being allies to being friends, which gets back to this being a lot about it being about relationships and about community building. And then one more aspect of being an anti-racist that I think we've heard a lot about is about willing to be uncomfortable. And I think we can get comfortable with being uncomfortable and start to become uncomfortable with being comfortable. Just noticing that feeling. In other words, recognizing, particularly if you're in an all-white setting, when the recognition of racism is not present in the conversation, or how things are being approached, or when it's clear that the experience of people of color is not being represented, or not just simply not present. I think I've been in a lot of situations where it's an all-white group and there's a conversation happening and I'm like, if there was a person of color in the room right now, we would be having a different conversation. I don't know exactly how it would be different, but I'm sure it would be different, and we're missing something by not having that perspective present. There isn't an easy answer about what to do about that, but you can't do anything about it until you recognize it. So for quick group exercise, I want to ask you, if you feel comfortable, to write in the chat just a brief sentence or two. Why are you doing this work? Why is the work of anti-racism important to you? Yeah, I'm gonna take a minute to just share in the chat your thoughts. I'm fucking sick of the harm. Great. Not on my watch. Great. Loathe injustice. Healing and liberation is all connected. Anti-racism equals justice. Wholeness, humanity, integrity, values. Love all people, all people. like to fix some issues in my community and be a better ally. Adhering to spiritual principles. That's interesting. We'll touch on that. My friends are leaving my community because of harm. That's real. So many inhumane things happening. Oh, this is great. Love the truth. Healing racialized trauma is part of that. Integral to systemic changes in regenerative culture. No freedom until all are free. Great stuff. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Let's see. So we want to go ahead and get into talking about anti-racist practices for intentional communities. So we're gonna in just a minute gonna share some examples, and then we're gonna open it up for some sharing and ideas from you all. So to the extent that this work is about systems change, intentional communities have a unique opportunity to experiment with systems change on a level that is more easily accessible, namely your community. And we're focusing in this workshop more on the policies and processes that create barriers, particularly for people of color. Not that people of color are all a monolithic group that all experience things in the same way or are comfortable or uncomfortable with the same things. But what can we see that might be barriers, and how can we shift things or be more flexible, even if it feels uncomfortable or destabilizing, which it will. We're also practicing our ability to see things that are barriers and go through the process to change things on an ongoing basis, because we're not going to see everything right away, and we're not likely to get it right the first time. And people who move in later on might run into things that people now didn't run into things, because again, people are different. It's not POC or white people are not monolithic groups that all experience everything in the same way. So this is an ongoing process, and it's about the process itself as much as the particular things that have to change. Part of the challenge here is that it might be your decision-making processes themselves that need to change for people of color to feel like they can bring things forward and have them addressed, which can be particularly challenging, especially for well-established groups with strong policies or institutional structures, because your group may really have to be willing to put a lot on the table and just figure it out together as you go along, which can be even more challenging when conflict or intense emotions come up, which they are likely to come up around this work. But this is just the work that there is to do. And when it comes to figuring out what things should be changed, it can be hard depending on how many, if any, people of color live in your community and how willing they are to participate in that process. Getting back to the emotional labor piece, we as white people, we need to not assume that people of color are going to be willing to participate in this, and we have to respect whatever boundaries they set around that. So you may be in the uncomfortable position of not having a lot of input to work with. And again, this is one of the places where this work is a lot about relationships. If you don't have relationships with people of color in your life where you can have these kinds of conversations, that might be a place to start. So to take a look at some examples that have been coming up, share the screen again. So if you were here for my last workshop, you might remember some of this, and some of this is sort of developed from input or ideas that came up in that workshop. So thanks to various people who contributed to that. So kind of lumped these into some categories just to help make it a little distinct. So labor, so including bridge building work and fulfilling labor requirements for people of color. So this came from one group that basically said, hey, it's a lot harder for people of color or LGBTQ or whoever to simply exist in our community, and we're going to make part of their work being able to bridge with their communities outside of the community. Having labor contributions be on a sliding scale depending on income. Financial considerations, so limiting the number of people over a certain income threshold who can live in the community and have people over that threshold make an extra contribution. There was a community last time that shared that they'd been doing this for a little while. creating an internal fund to help cover first month's rent kind of in quotation marks, because not every group has rent exactly, but whatever the sort of monthly contribution, if you have one, whatever that is, you know, a fund to help cover that first month's emergency or ongoing rent assistance or subsidies. Income sharing as an idea. If you're not familiar with income sharing, it's I'm not going to go into it, but there's a whole lot there, and there is a sort of basic way in which income sharing does you know, can sort of lower those barriers and really put everybody together in terms of making the finances work for everyone involved. And then oh, I got a little this got a little out of place here. Oh no, it's right. So looking for ways from your membership process creates financial hardship. So particularly for communities that have visitor periods or programs where you go for a period of time, that's harder to access for people who can't afford not to work because they have to pay their rent or whatever. So looking for ways to address that. In terms of space, designating spaces or buildings that are POC only, giving people of color priority with rooms, or if you have processes for moving into particular rooms or residences in your community, dropping those processes or reducing them for people of color. And again, thanks to some communities who were present in the last workshop for naming some of these things that they've been working with. Membership and decision-making, various things here. The idea of having a race quota, i.e. limiting how many people, white people, you can accept until you have more people of color, which is a big step to take, and you know, takes a lot of work to then figure out how do you actually make it a more accessible and friendly and inclusive place for people of color. So it's not, but it's an interesting sort of like way to sort of throw your hat over the wall, so to speak. If you're still a forming community, having a mixed race group of founders, just sort of starting it off right from the get-go like that can be crucial. When decisions about people of color or requests for proposals from them are being made, there needs to be at least one person of color that's in the room, part of making the decision. Making sure that your finances are transparent and budgeting is done democratically, and looking for ways your decision-making process is less accessible to some people. So for example, an emphasis on written policy and written communication is going to be easier for those who are college educated. So there's some various ideas. Again, some of these are things that we know groups are actually trying out or considering. Some of these are a little bit more generalized about how places to look. And again, like a lot of these are, you know, the intentional communities are very different, you know, different financial situations, different membership processes, whatever. So some of these might not be exactly relevant or applicable to you, but there's probably something similar that your community does that maybe this might inspire you. So I'm gonna stop sharing and open it up at this point for sharing. And the question here is simply, what are some practices? Oops, let me go back to screen sharing. What are some practices your community is considering or currently trying to become more inclusive and accessible? So if you would like to speak to this question, use the raise your hand function in Zoom to virtually raise your hand and we'll call on you. You can also share in the chat and we'll pull some things out from there and share them in the group.
Yeah, and again, these don't have to be necessarily successful. You know, maybe it was a failed attempt that you learned something from. So we're very open to hearing about your experience in general. So I see Natalie. You ready to share?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I live in an intentional community called Pilgrim Place that has been in existence for over 100 years, actually, in Claremont, California, in Los Angeles County. And we're a group of about 350 people, mostly retired. mostly faith-based. We're now interfaith, but also people who have worked in nonprofit organizations like Habitat for Humanity or YM or YWCA. We are really homogeneous. So 6 years ago, we began a study group to look at our whiteness and to read books that were focusing on being white in the United States. And now we're developing dialogues with African American groups. They're the old time groups like National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and National Council of Negro Women, all groups that have also been in existence for over 100 years. We want to be more intergenerational. That is certainly a challenge that we face. We've done some things with the Claremont colleges, Pomona, Scripps, Claremont, McKenna, Harvey Mudd, and Pitzer. But it's always a challenge, and especially now with the coronavirus and the students are not there. And we now are going to do a cultural competency training with a trainer from Multicultural Bridge in Western Massachusetts. The CEO there, Gwendolyn Hampton Van Sant. But I will say that there's a lot of resistance to becoming more diverse in terms of inviting people of color, and we're really seeing that. And it feels like a long slog, that we have a long way to go, but it's a matter of, well, I'm not racist and I've done this work. I worked in the civil rights movement already, and I don't need to do this. I don't need to do this work. So it's, you know, it's how to bridge that gap with older people who feel they've already done the work back in the 1960s.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's the kind of getting re-inspired and keeping that momentum going, and acknowledging that a lot of work has been done and you've been in it for a while. So I also want to pull out some themes of the self-education, raising your own awareness, and forming some relationships with other groups that have just as long-standing of a tradition as your own. That can be a nice common ground. And then participating in training. So yeah, thank you for your share. Appreciate those.
Thank you, Abby.
And Sky, we've got some chat examples, I think.
Yeah, you want me to go ahead and address some of those?
Yeah, and you feel free to continue to raise your hand if you have other ones.
So one person wrote, about 30% of our homes are designated for achievable housing, which is sort of a mid-range between affordable and insanely ridiculous market value. These are deed-restricted homes available to local employees in our resort town, where it can be really hard for locals to find a place to live. So that's, you know, great. Another, you know, again, a lot of these financial things are going to be very particular to your circumstances. So finding these ways, you know, again, like a housing co-op is going to be different from a co-housing community, which is going to be different from, you know, different kinds of, you know, like kind of more commune type communities in terms of how the finances work. But finding these ways to that are particular to your group about how to lower financial barriers is super key. Another person wrote, my community is considering a speaking order in meetings if 2 people raise their hand at once, calling on people of color first. I also, you know, I think there's the people have also done, you know, just people of color just get moved to the top of the stack. That comes up, which is, you know, which I think a lot of communities have also done in the past with around gender stuff too, to make more gender equity. So kind of, there's a lot of ways in which I think we can think about any work you've done in the past around gender equity and how to apply that to racial equity as well. And then somebody wrote, first, we are self-educating around anti-racism. Next, we are reaching out to our POC friendship circles to make sure they know we exist and are available. Have created a large BLM mural facing the street. That's great. So yeah, really putting yourselves out there and for that in that way. Having conversations on the street about our community. We are reaching out to mostly POC organizations and are considering a fully paid residency for a Black Lives Matter activist. Great stuff. And somebody else mentioned about trainings too, and I think this is something that in my experience with intentional communities, I've been an advocate for forever, is trainings, get trainings, have annual trainings, make trainings required. And I think stuff around racial justice, equity, that sort of thing is another thing to add to the list of things that it's great to have trainings of and actually have as sort of an expectation of people on a regular basis if you can get that in there. Somebody noted aorta training is a great start. So aorta is the, I'm not going to remember the acronym, but they're a co-op that provides trainings and a whole variety of things, including anti-racism and anti-oppression. If you go to aorta.coop, that's their website, and they're a really great group. They actually did an anti-racism training for the FIC board a few years ago, which was really great. Problem is that that addresses class on some level, but doesn't necessarily directly address race, and those are not the same things. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's a high tie-in between class and race, because as we know, the average Black family is 7 to 10 times less wealthy than the average white family. So there's a high correlation between race and class, but it's true. Got to keep in mind that they're not the same things. Workshops. Beginning to see anti-racism as spiritual work. I'm curious about that. Do you feel like speaking to that? Swami Dhumavadi?
Sure. And I'm going to be speaking for myself rather than my community right now, because we're, just getting into the waters. But I think somebody earlier put in the, I think one of the Mount Madonna people had written about ahimsa. And this is so deeply that work. And it feels like the world is being asked to look at this. And it's deep work. And without it being spiritual, it's inherently spiritual, I should say. Because it's about connecting to the deeper part of all of us and working through the surface crap, to be honest.
Cool. Thank you. Okay. Avi, anything else?
Yeah, something that I just want to bring forward was around the financial piece too, that, it's important to be aware that some of these practices we take on to reduce certain barriers can then become a barrier to other things. So for the income sharing in particular, at least I was noting from my experience of Black culture in particular, being financially independent is a very strong value. And so it would kind of create more of a barrier to go into an income sharing community where you're together in your finances and somewhat dependent on each other in that sense. So just being aware of that it's messy in that way, that, it's not a clear path forward necessarily, and that's part of the learning experience in some ways too.
Yeah. And then also just to say, again, I mean, people have been kind of speaking to it some, but connecting with groups outside of your community, and wherever you are, there are groups who are doing anti-racist work. So finding ways to support that, either just individually or as a community, if you can get your whole community and on board in some way. And then again, also to remember that there are majority or all POC intentional communities out there, and they're not, not necessarily essential to the movement. Sometimes they don't actually want to be as much on the radar because of concerns about safety, and at times, but they do exist. And so this is a place where, as a movement of intentional communities, we can bring more awareness to the fact that there is more diversity in this movement than we often realize. And how do we get that actually represented? How do we reach out? How do we make those connections, build those relationships with those communities? And I can say, as having visited a couple POC intentional communities, it was amazing to really see both the similarities and the differences to all or predominantly white intentional communities. And I think we want that kind of diversity in this movement as well. Like, that's another part of the diversity that's really important. So I would just encourage everyone to sort of look for ways your community can support those kinds of groups. And I have to say, like, once I just started looking for those kinds of groups, they weren't actually that hard to find. So just a little bit of encouragement in that way. And again, as Cynthia announced earlier, the FIC is committing 10% of donations to a fund to help start Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and working on developing the council and the whole program for that. So that's another way that you can look at supporting. And particularly there is a sort of a call. We're looking for groups to start making. If you don't want to make a donation right now to the FIC to help build that, you can also just make a commitment to a contribution directly to that fund, which we'll follow up with you later on once we've got more things in place. But if you think your community might be ready to make a commitment to support that fund in some significant way, then please reach out about that as well. Okay, so I think we're moving on here.
Yeah, and thank you for those who've shared. So one of the, I'd say, hardest parts of this work is dealing with instances and accusations of racism. So we want to speak to this, and mainly because there's really no clear right or wrong in these situations, and emotions can run high. So we don't have a lot of answers or best practices necessarily, but we are curious to hear about your experiences, and particularly like the guiding principles that we might use when responding to these types of instances. Because again, this is in the vein of building community and understanding with one another. So Sky, if you can share. Thanks for sharing. So we have noticed that there's a few kinds of incidents. This includes that somebody experiences an explicitly racist incident, someone experiences a pattern of implicitly racist incidents. There are ongoing issues around a person of color that on the surface doesn't seem to be race related, but possibly could be. When someone tries to get the group to look at implicit racism present in the community. And then if somebody experiences racism in the process of the group trying to address racism. So again, it comes in all forms, but we just kind of wanted to name some ways that you might see it showing up. And some key factors involved in these instances. First of all, whether it's a POC or a white person pointing them out can make a big difference. How many people are speaking up about it, if it's just one or more. The existing communication and conflict resolution culture in the community as a baseline. The existing institutional willingness and ability of the community to address issues and consider changes. And then the existing levels of trust and connection between members. So keeping this in mind, we're now going to go into some breakout groups, because we're very curious to hear if you've experienced these types of incidents in your community, what happened, what went well, what didn't go well, and again, what are those guiding principles that you had for responding? So we've given those questions to Cynthia so she can broadcast them once you're in the groups, and Sky just put them in the chat as well. But we'll take about 20 minutes in the groups, and if whatever is needed to help establish some trust when your group begins, we encourage you to speak up about that, if it's confidentiality, whatever it may be. But yeah, really, how can we learn from one another about our experiences?
All right, so I'm gonna open the breakout rooms, and you'll have, most of you will have three or four people in your groups. And like Avi said, it'll be open for 20 minutes, and then you'll come back here automatically. No need to worry about getting lost out there in Zoom land. It's an automatic process that'll bring you back. All right, so opening the rooms. Enjoy.
Still waiting to be sent.
You might have a pop-up button that is asking you to join. Let me see. No, I see. Okay. Just a moment. Let me see the problem.
What's sticking with you, what you learned, what you might like to share into the bigger circle, so we can all learn from one another.
Looks like people are kind of trickling back. Okay, here's another little flood of people.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, cool. Looks like we're back up to about where we were. Cool. So welcome back, everyone. Thanks for taking that time and sharing. I hope you had good groups. So we want to get some sharing from your groups. We're not necessarily looking for report backs, but if you want to share about whatever you shared about in your group, we'd love to hear, and we can maybe talk about it a little bit more. And just to say, if you don't need to use names. You can try, if you're feeling sensitive around identifying or anonymity or that sort of thing. Only share as much as you feel comfortable doing to respect that. But yeah, if you want to share, then please again virtually raise your hand in Zoom, and you can again also write in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on what you write there and respond to that as well. But so would anyone like to share about some kind of incident that you experienced or your community experienced, and how that went, or how it went well, how it didn't go well? We're looking to kind of workshop things here, because this is sort of the meat of it. I think we know that as a lot more groups are starting to really address this stuff, it's bringing more stuff up, and it's challenging at times, and we're all kind of feeling our way forward. So any brave soul? I haven't seen any hands raised yet.
I'm wondering, Sky, if you might want to start with your example that we were talking about.
Sure. So I was noting, in the announcement that the FIC made today about putting 10% of donations towards this new fund, we also set up an email address to sort of receive communications about it, and I've been the one kind of monitoring that email address initially, and there was a message that came through that was very short, two lines. This charity is racist and bad form, and no clear identification about whether the person who wrote it was white or a person of color or whatever. But that was, it was like, okay, interesting. And I have to say that I did kind of anticipate to some degree that there would be this reaction. And there's been various reactions in the conversations we've had about it. But I wrote back the person just very briefly saying, one, that we don't think this is a charity, and that's not how we're trying to set this up. And two, that this is a POC led initiative at this point. And I invited them to share more specifically what their concerns were, and that maybe I could address them if I knew more specifically what they were concerned about. But so that was a little thing that just came up, and yeah, so I mentioned that, and Avi was like, oh, you should share that. So that was one thing.
Yeah, I just thought it was important to note that, even when we do things that seem really great, getting money for something that a lot of people want to see happen, we can still get met with this kind of response. And instead of getting very reactive about it, Sky was asking more questions for understanding, right? So just wanting to pull that out too of a possible response. I see in the chat, how might you bridge the gap between a small group of people who are interested in anti-racism and making active anti-racism a project for the wider intentional community?
That's a really good question.
Can I add some color to that, since
Please.
that came from one of my friends and community members? We have been asking ourselves, to what degree is this, given that there's no neutral ground to stand on, to what degree do we have sort of an expectation of members, or make it a requirement of membership that you're somehow engaged in this issue, versus leaving people to have, to come to questions of anti-racism and anti-racism practice and action from wherever their starting point is, while not ceding ground to neutrality. I think that's where we're struggling. And Jennifer, say more if you have more to add, or anyone else who's struggling with this issue.
Well, we're involved in creating a new community. And so there are people who are involved that I get the sense they're not really interested in this. And there are other people that are really passionate about it. And there's no neutral ground. So how do we bridge, what is the way to bridge that gap? Is it to just start doing the work? Is it to require everyone to attend some kind of seminar? We're just not sure the best way to get started, introducing it to the larger group, I think, and trying to engage them on it.
Yeah, right. Especially since if you're a consensus group or going for something like consensus, if not everyone is in consensus about what it is that you should be doing, then that's going to be a tricky thing. I mean, I guess I'm thinking back to, again, what Crystal was really sort of emphasizing in her last workshop is like at some, you can't really change anyone else. Like, if nothing else, like it's just, you just got to keep doing your work and doing what you can do. And then continuing to try to be curious, listening, have those conversations with people to try and, see where there's movement, or where common ground, what kind of common ground you can find. Because I think part of what we're trying to get at in this workshop and trying to sort of bring together all these different kinds of things that different groups are doing is that there's an incredibly wide range of different things that you can do. So like, you can almost just like go down the list. It's like, okay, well, how would you support this? Well, would you support this? Or would you support this? And then again, I think you can keep, as individuals or groups within your group, again, also do that work of how do you connect with and support groups outside of your community, continue to build those relationships in such a way that then just keeps having more influence in your group as a whole, even if it's doesn't require other people to participate. I mean, and I guess the other little maybe dark side of this that I think is worth noting is like, as much as I think it is about relationships, and I really remember Crystal being like, don't lose the relationships over this stuff. Like, keep making sure that you keep the relationships. At the same time, I think as intentional communities, as cooperative groups, there may be, especially forming communities, there's always the potential for splits to happen. And you may get to a point where like, okay, there's a group of people who's actually really on board with this, and there's people who not, and maybe a split has to happen. I'm not suggesting you do that, but I think it's just, it's one of the ways that it can play out.
Could I also add something in there? Hi, I'm Julie. I am coming at this from the lens of having minimal intentional community experience, but a decently well-versed background in specifically like corporate realms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one thing, we kind of talked about this in our breakout group a little bit as well, that I have just generally tried to encourage people to look at or think about as they do this work is also the positioning that like racism, like definitely there's a lot there that is driven by individual perspectives and our own biases and individual experience. But when you're talking about creating a structure, when you're talking about addressing systemic racism, like those don't have to be inherently personal conversations. It doesn't necessarily have to be this perspective of like what I found in my work is that so many people are apprehensive about doing the work because they feel like it is a personal attack on who they are. Like if I haven't been doing anti-racist work all this time, does that mean I'm a racist? And that's just not a helpful question. It's really about how can we have conversations around making this a community or space that is inclusive and welcoming and where people feel like they fit. And that is a structural issue, right? Like that is, you know, it could be that training is required for your group, but like if you're thinking about it less from the perspective of you're being trained so that you could be less racist and more from the perspective of you're being trained so that this space can be more inclusive and that we can be more aware of these issues, then it just becomes a strategic and tactical issue like any other. Like, how are we going to do our grocery shopping? Are we going to share income and things like that? Like, it definitely doesn't have to be about people who are thinking about this as like a hobby, you know? Like this can definitely be just a platform that people have, if that helps.
Thank you.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Maybe I'm going to sort of open this up a little bit more and just see if there are other just kind of questions that you're kind of sitting with right now. I mean, we're still interested in hearing about maybe incidents or that sort of thing, but if there are particular questions that you have. Sharon Raymond, I saw you just raised your hand. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I just got the notice that Kamala Harris is the vice presidential pick, so I wanted to share that.
Yeah, people are knowing that in the chat too. Cool, thanks. Topher? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Yeah.
Hey. Uh-oh.
Sorry, I was trying to lower my hand, but instead I lowered my voice.
Yeah.
We got to an interesting point in our discussion. We talked about the thing I think you alluded to earlier about losing momentum and fledgling movements or fledgling groups kind of losing steam. And I think we talked a little bit about this idea of when these groups start, if they're mostly white people, I think there's a lot of like not wanting to engage because of a fear of like maybe, I don't know, like making further mistakes, like fucking up more or doing something wrong. And I think it's interesting because I think that's tied to a lot of things. That's tied to the making it personal instead of thinking about it systemically, not wanting to feel the guilt. And I think it's just, we had a talk like that in our community. And I think it's just really important to just like say, like recognize that you're just trying to avoid the conflict and avoid the discomfort and push into it and just, I don't know that there's like necessarily a guiding principle, but understanding that to make forward progress, you just have to do this harder work of maybe making those mistakes and learning not to take it personally. And I think for people in my community, like making that separation between personal and systemic was really helpful. We also talked about using language of like possessing whiteness instead of being white. As an Asian person in the United States, like an East Asian person, I think of myself as possessing some level of whiteness, but not of being white. And I think that also helps make it less personal for people because they think of possessing whiteness as like a less personal thing. They understand that like possessing whiteness comes from a system. So that's, I don't know, I think like that's the kind of thing that can help. I really resonate with what Julie was saying about making it systemic and not personal.
that what that also makes me think about is I know in a couple groups that I've been hearing from, there's been stuff coming up around people who identify as mixed race, and the sort of the whole spectrum of experience that people have depending on what their racial background is, whether they identify as mixed race, what those different races are, and then of course how that intersects with any number of other factors, including gender and class and that sort of thing. But I think just there's such a tremendous spectrum of experience that we're dealing with here. It's an important thing to keep in mind. Any other questions or comments at this point? Should double check our time.
Yeah, I just want to say I've been really, enjoying the comments that have been happening, and just noticing that we're all at different places in our journey on this call, and like I still make mistakes. I still take active trainings, and just really encouraging everyone, who's maybe new on this journey to sign up for a discussion group, or, just really like, don't let this be like the last thing you do, just keep, if you're scared, just wanted to say some positive words, just keep doing it, whatever, just keep learning, keep making mistakes, and just, stay on this journey. I'm just so grateful that more and more people are doing this work.
Cool. Thanks for that. Okay, we got two hands up, so we'll hear from you all, and then we'll move on. Natalie Shiras.
Yeah, thank you. Piggybacking on what Alyssa said about we're a diverse group and keep at it. One of the things I wrote on why I'm doing this work when you asked that first question was looking at the truth of racialized trauma. And our group at Pilgrim Place has been reading my grandmother's hands, racialized trauma and how to mend our bodies and our souls, by Resma Menachem, who is a trauma counselor in Minneapolis. And he works with white groups, African-American groups, and police groups to deal with the trauma in each of those groups that, that we face in this country around racialized trauma. So I think it's easy to say, keep at the work, keep doing it, don't be afraid to jump in. And what we've learned after 3 years of these racial dialogues, we met monthly with NAACP and National Council of Negro Women, and we got kind of depressed after the second year, realizing, there's a lot of work here. Well, what do we need to do? And that's when we started to really work on this racialized trauma. It's really a deep dive into, our own psyches. We have counselors we're working with now. These are people who've done racial work, lots of us all of our lives, but who never dealt with the trauma of the cultural racialized trauma. So I wonder if you can respond to this aspect of it in terms of the healing of our bodies and our bodies and our hearts and our minds together.
I mean, the one thing that I can say is just from what I've heard from, particularly, I think somebody in the chat mentioned there's a woman named Leah Penniman, who's part of a community called Soulfire Farm in upstate New York, and she wrote a book, Farming While Black, and I interviewed her for Communities Magazine a couple years ago, and she talked about the incredible healing as a Black person and working with other people of color and Indigenous people and around reclaiming that relationship with land and the deep healing around trauma that's done. And then another friend of mine named Aaron Johnson down in Southern California, who is a Black man who does anti-racism work and natural building, and he talked about the same thing around the healing of trauma around getting his hands in the dirt and building his own earthen home around that. So yeah, definitely some good stuff there. Meredith, you want to go ahead and unmute and share, or ask a question?
Yes. Well, I wanted to just say my experience with my community. One thing that where we started basically was doing a media club, like a book club, but we also included videos and articles and podcasts and things. And it's unrelated to the organization, but we just called it by the name of our organization and you know, announced it in our organization, and you know, recommended reading and had a list that was publicly accessible. And recently, the way we've started to try to do the work is to have a series of community conversations around racism, and looking in our community. One of the most important things we've done so far is we had a community conversation in which a lot of leadership was present, but asked not to speak or be in charge, but asked to listen, and then had people share what they felt was present or missing in our organization that allowed systemic racism within our organization to exist. And it was really surprising to a lot of people how much people had to share on that topic, how many things people were able to identify. So it's given us kind of a place to move forward and a thing to look for. Our next step is that we want to have a panel with people that basically the same question you asked us when we moved into our groups about, like, what have you done in your communities, and what's worked and what hasn't worked to address, you know, structural racism within our intentional communities. So I guess my question would be, has anybody done something like that in their communities? And if so, do you have any recommendations for me? That's all.
Great question. I want to go ahead and start to move on. If you have some direct responses to that, go ahead and throw those into the chat. I mean, but I definitely know that lots of communities have been doing things like that, like having series of meetings on this. So you're definitely not alone in that work. And yeah, so definitely good stuff happening there. Thank you. Okay, just to wrap up this section, we do want to move on. We're starting to get close to the end of our time. Avi and I did want to share briefly some thoughts that we had on kind of guidelines for responding to incidents of racism. So, and a lot of this has already kind of come up in the discussion. So just briefly, you know, one thing is shifting the benefit of doubt. We have this sort of innocent until proven guilty thing in our culture, but sort of shifting almost to assume that if a person of color in particular is saying that there's racism, or there's that some issue that there is that it is race-based, or there's something going on there, that assume it's true, believe them. Which doesn't mean don't think critically about the situation, don't look at it, don't have conversations about it, you know, don't necessarily take it for granted, but assume that it's true, or that there's some truth, and look for what that is, and address whatever it is, whatever aspect of race might be present, and make sure that is being really taken seriously and addressed. Reflect on or call upon your shared values. So Avi will talk about a little bit this more, but you know, probably in your values, stated values as a group, there's probably stuff that is already related to this. And if it's not clear, or if it's unclear how your existing values apply, have that conversation. And then also just being aware that, you know, as somebody noted, there's this sort of the taking it personally for yourself aspect. There can also be a taking it personally for your community, like identifying yourself with your community and feeling defensive on behalf of your community, and kind of being conscious of that. And then just simply asking for support. Like, you know, again, we've been talking about, people have been noting their big fears about being wrong, being accused, and just making sure that you're setting up the support, or that you have the support, and that you're supporting others. That's crucial.
Before you move forward, Sky, I just wanted to put forward you know, when we were talking about the spiritual aspect of this, and in terms of shared values, of like really finding those values that's already within your community that you can connect to this work, and then therefore have like a stronger foundation for why we're doing it and what you can go back to when these things come up and how we're gonna, you know, move forward in it. So yeah, just wanted to bring that forward. Okay. So our last bit, you know, there's this question of how do we keep it going? How do we reignite this passion, this need to keep the work going when we get burnt out, when we get depressed, whatever it may be. So excuse me, we're calling it Lead with Love. And it's the 5 A's of Love. This comes from a book. I laugh because I don't actually love this book, but it had some real good nuggets, and this was one of them. It's a book called How to Be an Adult in Relationships by David Rico, and he points out these 5 A's of love. And I just think it's a really nice framework to use for any situation, but particularly when we're talking about this work. So we're going to go through each A and then offer like some questions around, you know, what does that mean? And then a particular practice that you could take on to keep it going. So starting with attention, first A of love, attention. How can we bring this work more into our daily life? That idea of, for some of us, we need to opt in. It's not as direct in our life. How can we remember that our commitment to this work, to continue this work and keep showing up? So a practice we were thinking about is, you know, right now it's very prevalent in our society, wearing a mask because of COVID. And it's such a particular reminder that this is not our normal, quote unquote, life right now, that this mask means that something else is going on. And so what is a type of mask, or like another symbol that you can have that's a visual symbol that can daily remind you that this is something that's important for you and that you want to bring into your awareness on a regular basis. And you, of course, you know, can consider making the mask colorful, or, you know, having some written word on it, whatever it may be. But yeah, just having something tangible that you can look at each day to keep it going. Next one, for acceptance. How can we continue to raise our awareness about what is in the world around us and where we are as a community within this work? So this is something I assume most of us are pretty, have done a lot of in intentional community, is to set intentions and review them regularly. You know, let's consider if you want to have a monthly discussion group, or if you want to read one book per month, or whatever it may be, of just really considering how you're going to continue to educate yourself and your community, trainings, etc., and set those intentions, and you continue to come back to them and just notice where you are within that work. Our next A is affection. So how can we create and deepen personal relationships, especially with those who are different from us? How can we cultivate affection for our individuality? And the idea of listening has come up a lot. You know, part of this work involves a lot of listening. And so this is one practice of listening pairs where one partner shares for 5 minutes and the other partner just listens. And then that partner repeats back what they heard in first person. And you can do you know, whatever works for you within this, but we did this in our community, and there is something about hearing your story told back to you in first person that helps the other person put themselves in your shoes, and also like really deepens that feeling of being heard and understood. So consider a listening pair for affection. For appreciation, what are we learning? And how can we appreciate the hard moments? So a practice for this could be a gratitude journal of lessons that you've learned and experiences that you've had, such as the ones that we just heard from various communities, and just noting it. You know, it's important that we acknowledge what work has been done too, and especially for those moments that come up that are hard and maybe we didn't respond as well as we wanted to. Like how do we find the gratitude and appreciation within that too? And finally, allowing what happens when we make mistakes. How can we continue with the work when we feel burnt out or overwhelmed? And silence as a practice, something Mount Madonna has been practicing for a while. And it just really allows for you to feel into whatever's there, to pause, to reflect, to notice, especially when we're in reaction mode. Just practicing silence can really help move us through and help us get to a place where we can take ourselves out of the reaction and the high emotions a little bit more to see a little clearer. So those are the 5 A's of love with some practices that you can consider, but in general, just that idea of how do we continue to bring our love to this work and to each other.
Before we share some parting thoughts, we've got a few minutes. I just wanted to see if there was any last questions or comments, or maybe some other ideas of practices that anyone wanted to share. Ryan Nichols.
Hello. I'm wondering if you can say some words about if a person of color raises an issue in whatever tone of voice that they may raise it in. What are some good strategies for white people to be able to receive that and respond to them? Or if a white person is very much so advocating for a person of color in some appropriate way.
Avi, you want to respond?
Yeah, you want to throw that one my way? I'll go back to silence and really listening. I think that's the first thing. If you're being confronted with something that feels uncomfortable to you, is to see if you can listen and not say anything. Just hear the person, take that in, and then at a later time, you can ask to come back to it once you've had some time to kind of process. So that's the first thing that I would say. In terms of advocating for a person of color, I think first and foremost, it's important to make sure that that person wants to be advocated for. So asking for consent and permission, and also what exactly, like making sure you understand their experience enough to speak to it if that's what they want. So those are a couple things. I want to wisdom in the room too. I want to open that up if anyone else has a response.
I think it's worth noting too, like on the side of with white people, or like this stuff between white people. Again, I think it's this thing where I think it, personally, I think it's really unfortunate when, I addressed this in the last workshop I did. There's this sort of like being the least racist white person in the room, or the find the racist game that white people can get into, this sort of like self-righteous virtue signaling, performative sort of thing, which just a lot of times isn't helpful. And perhaps should be addressed, but that still doesn't mean that the content of what they're saying might not be valid, or there might not be some important things to look at in that. So part of that is that parsing out of what is still the things that need to be addressed, regardless of how it's being expressed. And then, and also again, amongst white people, I think this is another place, as Avi was saying, the sort of the silence that just, and Crystal in her workshop talked about like, just apologize and that's it. Don't say anything else, or or even just to appreciate, say thank you for sharing, and then go find other white people, or if you do have people of color in your life that are open to having those kinds of conversations, like work stuff out with them before kind of bringing it back. Hope?
Sorry, I don't actually know how to raise my hand in this, but I was hoping to also add, there's,
yeah, please.
If you guys haven't seen it, there's a really great excerpt. You could probably just do a Google search for it around white supremacy culture. And an interesting facet of that, if it hasn't been touched on here, if you haven't seen it, is even the notion of advocating for someone else on their behalf, or the notion of like somebody taking a tone that is that makes it difficult to hear them. Like those are things that are indoctrinated in us and based on this principle that there is a role for people of color to be quiet and let other people speak for them. And that it's the way that you say something is more important than what you actually say, when in real life, like, yes, the way that we say things can make other people feel ways about things, but it doesn't, as you noted, Sky, it doesn't like remove the validity of what you're saying. And so I think it's hard for us to unlearn that element of like, I'm just trying to help this person. Why are they taking this position with me? But that white supremacy culture like framework actually helps a lot in really addressing those types of issues.
Right, thank you. Okay, Hope has their hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Yeah, so I'm in a forming community, and we've been forming for, a lot of years now, and we don't have founding members who are people of color. And the one person of color we do have right now in a leadership position we're in the process of alienating. And one thing that I hear from people that I just wonder how to address is the idea that, we've got this big vision, we've got so much to do, we can't do everything. We have principles and intentions for racial equity, social justice, economic justice. Well, maybe we'll just have to get the thing built with any way we can, and we'll do that later. It's just a diversion, it's a digression. It's something we can't afford right now, basically. And not everyone feels that way. There are many people who are quite passionate about this. I happen to be one of them. Racial equity and all of that, as I've mentioned. And I just, but that is a theme that I hear, and I'm just putting it out there for any wisdom that anyone might be able to offer. Hello?
Yeah, no, we hear you.
Oh.
Thank
Sorry.
you. No, I think we go ahead, Abby.
I just wanted to say, I just think, first and foremost, there's such a huge opportunity for those who are forming to really create structures and things that work. And so by putting it off, this, it really creates more work for you in the long run. And you're really missing that opportunity in the fore. So, there's that, is like really paying attention to where you're at and what you're able to do right now.
Yeah. I think this speaks to some of what, Avi, what you were really bringing forward around the values, and maybe Hope, part of what's there is that there's some difference in your group around what the purpose of the community is. And so, for example, in intentional communities, the mission, so to speak, is all across the board. Like some are very mission driven, service activism, trying to do something in the world, and others, their mission is essentially having a nice place to live or being good neighbors. And so if your primary goal is to have a nice place to live and be good neighbors, then yeah, maybe doing this racial justice work is kind of a distraction from that. But if you have more of a sense of your values really being aligned with doing racial justice work, then you're going to see it as crucial or instrumental. And so maybe there's some underlying difference there around the values or sense of purpose or mission amongst your group, and so maybe that's a place to have a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I noted Cynthia know that Susan Hedgepeth was maybe trying to raise their hand.
Yeah, that's me.
Please go ahead.
So thank you, Hope, for saying that. And it's similar to what I was going to share. I'm kind of envious that you're in a forming community, because I think it might be actually easier at that point to gather around you people who have the same goals and values. And so I'm living in a 19-year-old co-housing community and have had a really hard time getting the mostly white other people here to be interested in learning and educating ourselves. The two steadfast allies and compadres I have are here today, Yehudit and Cheryl. But you know, we've attempted book groups and films and workshops and discussions at common meals, and the interest just does not sustain. And plus, there are just so many other things. Anybody who's living in community knows there are just so many other things to figure out and to decide together. So I guess I don't have a question or a comment. I'm just feeling kind of frustrated by the whole thing. And I think the answer is that this is not something that's going to be solved quickly. It's a marathon. My community is not going to be diverse in my lifetime, I'm pretty sure. But I'm glad that all of you are here, and I feel like that's a good group of white allies and who want to make their communities more representative of the world. So that's all.
Right, thanks. All right, well, we've got 5 minutes left, so I think we're going to just go ahead and share some parting thoughts, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. Let's see, share screen one more time. So again, just some quick thoughts, you know, that Avi and I, put together, just try and, kind of help sum up and move us forward. This work is about building relationships in community and creating real change, not being right. Let's lift each other up, not tear each other down. Ultimately, this work is personal and situational, embrace the nuance and ambiguity. Every person and situation is different. The principles, guidelines, and generalities are important, but will only take you so far, and adapt as the circumstances and people change over time. And this work is an ongoing practice. And as I think Susan was just speaking to, it's an ongoing practice to figure out how to integrate this in a sustainable way on an ongoing basis into our lives, given everything that we may be dealing with. It's not going to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes. That's just part of the process. Keep at it, and in whatever ways that you can find to do that, either personally or with your allies, or if your whole community is on board, just find those different ways to keep at it and to keep leading with love. Avi, anything to add?
I just really appreciate everyone being willing to show up and share their experiences, and the feeling that you might be having of this support right now. I encourage you to consider how you might be able to keep that going. So is there another community on this call or around you physically that you can connect with and just share your experiences? But really try to bring yourself that support, because we really need it in this work in order to keep it going. So.
Yeah, great. Cool. There's a couple last good comments in the chat here. Topher wrote, clear on goals and values, calling us what separates us from a golf club question. That's great. If the focus is on making a nice experience, then not much, but presumably the reason we choose intentional communities, we believe in certain values, and belief in those values implies an orientation. You want to have people in the world beyond your community. It's great. Thanks for that. And Alicia wrote, consider strategies for how to make anti-racism a social norm in your community. You may have more silent allies than you think. It's a good point. Who are afraid to step up. Considering lowering the bar, risk for people to step up, making themselves known as allies. Great suggestion. So that's our time. You're going to get a follow-up email with the recording of this, as well as our notes for this workshop, a link to our notes, as well as a link to the slides. And then also we had a questionnaire that we put out a week or so ago, asking some of these questions about, examples of practices, examples of incidents, and how you address them. So there'll be a link to that questionnaire as well. So if you want to share more information of us, we're hoping to just kind of keep gathering information about all of this to be able to share amongst the movement. So look for that. And Avi, anything else?
Thanks, no. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sky and Ivy. That was awesome. Yeah, thank you for just being here, for donating your time to be with us and sharing your wisdom and holding the space for everyone here to also share ideas and stories. So yeah, I'll be in touch with you all via email, and thank you for coming. We can open our mics and just share our appreciation as we close out.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Great job.
Thank you. It was wonderful to be here.
Thank you.
It was really, really good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, bye. Take care.
Have a great day, everyone.
Everyone.
You.
Good conversation.